And the important part for us is that with this election cycle, we have a unique window of opportunity where white inclined women are once again having opportunity to engage with active Black women and to be more receptive to critique or feedback
Mhm.
and to learn how to move beyond ally into actual advocate or operative. And so I'm
Mhm.
building this container so that on November 6th, we can continue doing what what has erupted here. And
Yeah.
I don't want to see us lose that momentum. And so it's a unique crossroads in our
Yeah.
world.
It's an exciting crossroads, and that group of white women is gonna be important. It's, like, not only hugely important leading up to the election, but also no matter which way the election goes, there's gonna be a lot of work to be done.
Yes, exactly. And it gives us a chance to talk about things that we had to tiptoe around before. So even as DEI, and that word has become a bad word, and we started this for bringing back joy to DEI because I was dealing with so many people who are burned out in the space.
Yeah.
But as that has receded, at the same time, white women are more open to hearing about our biases and our privilege and how to not be defensive about looking at the history and hearing the stories differently. So I have remarried during the pandemic, and I married a man who has biracial children. And my son has remarried an Asian woman, and they now have two beautiful multiracial children. And so my white bubble has, of necessity, expanded as the culture has shifted. And so I have very personal reasons, but your bio and your information about multiracial identity, I am so excited to share with our listeners your story about why this matters to you and what your research and what you're doing with that.
Thank you. I am also excited by all the new research on multiracial identity. I remember growing up and feeling so alone. When I grew up in Western Michigan, it was very, very white. We were the only Black family in town. And so even if you look at me, you might not immediately know I'm Black. It was readily apparent to everyone who saw my dad, this is a Black person. And they operated, I was the one Black girl in the school. People made fun of me based on how I looked because it was different than the blonde hair, blue eyed stereotype that they were used to. And so I remember, yeah, feeling alone and not really understanding what it was like to be mixed because I was seen only as Black. And then when I went to college, I was so excited to have Black friends. And I remember walking in and people looking at me like, "Why is she here?" And that was so that was identity shattering for me because I had always been my whole life the identity other people put on me. Now
Uh,
people are putting a different identity on me as like, "Oh, mixed people don't look like you." Like, I have friends who are half Black and, their hair is curlier or their skin is darker, and so I became fascinated with how we like, what are the phenotype characteristics that we give Black people, that we give mixed people, and how does identity validation or invalidation shape a multiracial person's identity development? And it's so interesting, you're talking about your, grandchildren, I believe. And it's like they might look totally different, but if you have the same, like within siblings. So I started interviewing people and I would interview siblings who had different life experiences, even though they're raised in the same house, they were given the same cultural education, but maybe one looks more Asian to somebody or somebody looks more white. And then that affects how they grow up and then their sense of self. And so that's what really got me started on this multiracial journey into me getting my PhD and interviewing over 100 multiracial people on how they identify because I was just so fascinated how people see us is so much a part of our identity and that shifts based on context.
Oh, that is interesting. And at what age it shifts probably matters too. If you change, if your family moves when you're 12 and that shifts, how do people navigate that?
It, right now, not well. I mean, it really depends on it. Each family is different, each person is different, each I think there's a lot of cool things going on now that didn't exist when I was growing up. So, my like second cousin has this like multiracial children's play group collective. And so they're around a bunch of other mixed kids. And so I'm sure he has a much more stable identity, a much more stable sense of self because he's around a lot of other multiracial children who are confident in their identities. But a lot of the people I interviewed, so the people were like 18 to 30. So and that was about 5 years ago. But just because so much of it is cohort related because we live in a different growing up now, it's gonna look a lot different than growing up 20 years ago.
Sure.
And will continue to change.
Mhm.
But there was a lot of families just not talking about it. And so people just were developing their identities in silos or based on the media or based on what their friends were saying. Um, and so it's difficult. And I think it's less difficult the more education you have, but it doesn't take away all the difficulty. So you can learn at a young age that race is a social construct or a political invention, and you can learn that your identity is yours to choose. But that doesn't take away how much it can sting when someone invalidates your identity and says that you're not enough.
But the reality is no two people in the same family are
Yeah,
going to have the same experience of the first time I realized that it wasn't okay for me to have a black friend. I was 4 years old.
yeah.
Or the first time somebody figured out that, that they got treated differently when they were out with dad versus if they were out with mom.
Totally. I have distinct memories of being a kid and walking with my dad, who was often the only Black person in a room. But then one of the fun things about my family is my dad created a museum on racist memorabilia. And so we would be in all these random situations, like looking for racist memorabilia. But so that to say, I had some instances of being around people of color with my dad. And as a young child, could see like, okay, here we fit in, here we don't fit in. And it's like children are making sense of this even when we think that they're not, even when things aren't explicitly said. Like at 4 years old, maybe no one directly said it's not okay for you to have a black friend, but you could pick up,
Mhm.
you could see what they were saying when in the things they weren't saying.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. You could feel the energy in the room shift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And kids are and that's how they learn, and that's why I love when I used to teach, I would also, like, pressure test my students because they would say, "Oh, I can tell if somebody's Black," and I'm like, "How?" And then once you really get into it and they're like, "Okay, well, if they have this characteristic, if they have, like, curly hair or dark skin," I'm like, "Well, you all have friends who have light skin or, like, maybe they're wearing a wig or, like they have a different hair texture and you still know that they're Black. So, like, let's really get into how we are categorizing people and how we think we know these things. Because everything we think we know about race, we were taught.
By the time you are 18 years old, you have received from your family of origin a master's degree in dysfunction.
Yeah.
It is 18,000 hour parent tapes, unedited, running through
Yeah.
your script going
Yeah.
forward. And it takes sometimes a lifetime to deconstruct that. So you are getting your PhD now. Yeah, yes.
I got my PhD already.
Oh, congratulations. So what is your role and what is your passion and where are you headed now?
Yes. Okay. So my dissertation was on second generation multiracials. So most of the research is in this first generation, like your grandkids. They have one Asian parent, one white parent. Barack Obama.
Mhm.
How does their children identify? And that's what I was really curious about because the research was super focused on this first generation of racial mixing. And for Black white people, a lot of times the research was okay, they are mostly perceived by other people as Black, they mostly identify as Black. I'm like, well, that's not necessarily true. So I really started thinking about it. And that's when I was like, let me interview people in the second generation of racial mixing. And I found a couple of things. One of them being if you have a black white parent like Meghan Markle and then a white parent like her husband, and that child is actually going to be more likely to identify as mixed than somebody like Malia or Sasha Obama who has like one black white parent, one black parent. They're more likely to identify as black, which we might assume. However, there are some people in that group that still identify as mixed. They're like, no, I have a mixed parent. I identify as multiracial. There's actually just a contestant on Love is Blind in this category of people, and everyone was like, "You're not mixed." I'm like, she does have that option to identify as multiracial. We can't keep telling people what their identity is. The second thing I was really thinking about is how is racial categorization and the racial hierarchy in the US shifting? So when race was invented 400 some years, when we were in the process of inventing this idea of race in America, it was white people and black people. Black people were on the bottom, white people were on top. Lots of different things have happened, immigration, uh, interracial marriage, and we're seeing this shift from this biracial hierarchy with white people on top, black people on the bottom, to a sort of triracial hierarchy with white people on top,
Yeah,
this group of sort of honorary whites, which we
yeah,
might say are like light-skinned multiracials, um, light-skinned Asian people like Korean or Chinese. And then we have a group of like this collective black. And so it's black people, but it's also dark-skinned Asians like Indians or dark-skinned Latinx people. And so we are kind of shifting to this triracial hierarchy. And so that's really one of the findings from my research is just sort of corroborating this idea that we're sort of have some mixed people in this honorary white status where they have some of the privileges in proximity to whiteness, but it's tenuous and it can be taken away from them. And then we have this group of the collective black. Yeah, it's such a learning lesson. And I feel like for a long time, people felt dirty for having privilege. We felt icky. We wanted to turn away from it. And it's like we all have our different forms of privilege. Like even for black folks, there's light skin privilege, which means you're going to be treated differently than someone with a dark skin color. But it's like, where do we have those privileges? And then how do we use it for good? It's not icky that we have. I mean, of course, we all get privileges through icky ways, but it's
right.
how are we then using it for good?
Right. I'm thinking about our family, for
Mhm,
example, but the only ones who really experienced that firsthand are his two daughters who are now in their 40s, right?
mhm.
Who actually spent time in white households and black households and navigating that. What are unique challenges or experiences are there? Any trends that you see that second generation have that first generation didn't?
Yeah, one of those being how you're saying the opportunity to meet with extended family. So there, if you are in the second generation of racial mixing and you have one mixed parent and one white parent and you don't get to interact with your black family at all, it can be difficult to develop a strong identity in a racial group if you don't have close relationships with black relatives, if you're not around black. I mean, there's other ways besides family you can get sort of that cultural education, but for a lot of people, if they don't have that, that feels like a gap. And I came up with this term, which is racial imposter syndrome, which is this idea of feeling like you're an imposter. Like I'm telling people I'm mixed, but I don't know all the black lingo or like the TV shows that people would have watched with their black grandma growing up or the songs. So they develop sort of this imposter syndrome around their own racial identity. And so I see that in the second generation of racial mixing a lot more where you're just, yeah, you feel like an imposter. Um, and even when they have validating experiences, it's sometimes not enough to overcome that source of doubt that they have, that they're not enough. But then you see the opposite side of that. Like I interviewed one person who had a black white parent and a black parent and was so close with his Italian grandma and was like, this is such a core part of my identity. I identify as mixed because like even though everyone around like people are shocked to hear that I'm mixed, he felt so close to that culture as a result of those relationships. So it can also be really additive for people. Part of what my work does talk about is white women raising mixed kids. And that's a lot of probably what your next speaker will talk about, which is like the learning, unlearning, like I don't know what there is to know. And part of that is going to be the same whether that's your biological kid or an adopted kid. It's like that is a different lived experience than you have. And I think the best case scenario is the people are doing the work, doing the research. Worst case scenario, which is um, one of my neighbors in my very white place growing up was like, but isn't love enough? Like, doesn't the kid just need love? And I just thought to myself, no, you're bringing a non-white person to this lily white area. Love is not enough. You have to understand their experience. You have to make it a safe space for them. And it's especially difficult with your children. It's hard to have conversations about race as a white person. You kind of how you were talking about in the beginning, you don't want to say the wrong thing. It's
Mhm.
you're not sure what to say, so sometimes you don't say anything, and that's worst case scenario is not saying anything and not acknowledging the difference.
And so are you gonna write a book with all of this information that you have bubbling up?
I would love to. I've written 2 articles, which I can give you to put in the bio. Some of them I have, like, a paywall, so if people email me, I'll just give them the free version on the down low. But I would love to because I got so many in my dissertation is published, I wouldn't recommend reading it because they say a good dissertation is a done dissertation.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the things I think that is a fault with academic literature is so much of it is about moving theoretical advancements and less about the stories that we're hearing. And so if I wrote a book, I would love for it to just be the really compelling stories about the nuances of being mixed. I so value the time everyone gave me speaking to me and really sharing some of the most personal things or things they haven't told other people before. And I would love to honor that with a book. One of the stories I'm thinking about um, as we're talking that didn't make it to the dissertation, but it's such a good story in a sad way. This woman that I interviewed when she was a little girl, she like looked very white, but she's mixed. She has a black father, it's someone who identifies as black, but he's mixed. He got pulled over for kidnapping his own daughter because the police officer looked in the car, saw a black man with a white child, and said, "This isn't a family."
Oh.
And it's just like these things, they shape our identity, they shape our experiences, and then someone, on TikTok might look at this woman and be like, "Oh, you can't identify as mixed, you look white." And it's like she has a very mixed experience. Like all the her life experiences indicate that she's mixed. Like that's the type of story that really only happens to a multiracial child. We're now increasingly seeing mixed people in commercials. It's becoming a lot more common in the media, but folks aren't really talking about multiracial identity development.
It is okay to say black and white, but
Yes.
it's descriptive. And
Yeah,
I just actually I have merch that's getting ready to come out. I'm gonna show you. We'll do that.
that's
Colorblind is still
awesome.
blind. Because I heard so much from white women about, oh, well, we're colorblind because, 30 years ago, that was the desired state to be. Don't notice race, don't notice color, don't talk about it, treat everybody the same. Well, that's not, that creates more of a divide and more of a problem than saying the experience and the privilege I carry because of white skin
Hmm.
makes my walk through the world different than these women who said to me in 2020, you will not understand until you've had to sit your son down at 15 and explain the realities of if you get stopped by a police officer, you're a
Yeah,
black man.
yeah,
And this is what has to happen. It broke my heart because I absolutely have never lived that experience. And it is why George Floyd's story pulled me into the narrative of my mother's heart was touched. And
yeah.
I'm grateful, so grateful. But what happened after that turns out to be a pattern of what happens with white women and the black women now that I'm on TikTok quite a bit, the black women when Kamala first announced and, and all of the women got together and did all their calls and everything. And the black women were saying, I remember what you did to our mothers and our grandmothers.
Yeah.
And I won't, I won't trust you. And
Yeah.
absolutely respect and I understand
Yeah.
that colorblind is still blind. It is not, this is not something to be proud of.
Yeah, it doesn't honor people's lived experience at all, and I have chills as you share that because it is true. When George Floyd happened, and even before, I remember I have this Black cousin who is the nerdiest, weirdest, like, theater kid ever, and I'm like, but when he walks down the street, he's gonna be seen as a Black man, even though the kid is like, just this goofy little kid, but it's like, that's not how he's gonna be treated by police, and having we watched, Blackish had a episode that was kind of like a precursor to having the talk with your children about what it means to be Black and wear a hoodie or and I remember just being so torn up that I had to have this conversation with this person who was like would be stereotyped as a thug and is just the furthest thing from it, and I'm like, "What a shame he can't have that freedom to be a little boy." And we have to have this conversation with him because you have to be safe. I mean, I'm so proud of the work that you're doing and the white women who are willing to lean in and listen and do the hard work because I think one of the other things we saw after 2020 is the DEI fatigue and white women kind of being like, I don't want to do this anymore, or like people just getting really tired. And it, Black women, we can't do that. We can't get too tired to do the work. It's our life depends on it. Our children's life depends on it. And so there's no DEI fatigue for us. We have to keep doing it. While I was in my PhD, I did a lot of DEI work on college campuses. So I was really consumed with how do we make this an inclusive experience? So many of these spaces are built on white supremacy. You know, Black folks weren't even allowed in until 100 years ago. And then you think just because now we're here, it's different. It's like, no, this is entrenched in our systems. These schools were not actually built for us. And so I did a lot around how do you build a thriving, marginalized community in these different universities. And a lot of that is just resources and having someone dedicated to it, willing to do it. One of the hard things that happens in academia, and I think also happens in corporate spaces, is they set up these DEI roles, but don't actually want the person to do DEI work.
Yeah.
And there, it's kind of like a figurehead of like, look, we did it, check.
Mhm.
And if the person ever pushed back, then they're labeled a problem. And so there was so much work to be done before DEI was a dirty word. Now that DEI is a bad word, we're 100 steps back.
Right, right. And so a lot of what prompted One Voice Evolving to begin with was exactly that. People who had burned out, who'd been doing it for 20 or 30 years and would get their hopes up and then new election cycle and it down. And it was just, and the check the box of corporate America and how quickly this year when they said, oh, you don't have to do it anymore. Okay, good.
Yeah. Microsoft
Decimate
was
that.
like, okay, let's fire the whole DEI team.
Yeah, we didn't really, wasn't really that important anyway. We just had to check the box. And the checking the box is what causes the burnout in people who have hearts and passion for that. And so I watched some of them try to regroup and do an end run or work around it or, all the ways you navigate. But one of the ways you navigate is by buying into the patriarchal system.
Mhm.
You go along to get along, which weakens the impact you can make. Did you
Yeah.
see or experience that in your time?
Oh, totally. Yeah, I see. And then what's really hard is when you have a mix between those two groups. So you have someone in power who's just going along to get along, and then you have the group of really eager people. And for so long, I was that eager person who was like, we need max amount of change as fast as possible. And then you work in these systems that are deliberately slow
Mhm.
on things that are DEI related. They can be very fast when it advances what they want to be fast in. Easy. Things are done very quickly if the president wants it to be done. But it is very hard to work as someone who's eager with somebody who has found themselves in a DEI position and is just going along to get along because for whatever reason they've gotten. Maybe they tried to push back and it didn't work. Maybe they never tried to push back. Maybe they have imposter syndrome. There's a lot of reasons why people in DI roles are
Mhm.
not actually doing the work. But yeah, I definitely burned myself out doing DI stuff. That's actually how I transitioned into corporate America is because my it is so hard to get your heart set on something and to see something so clearly as a good to fight for it so hard and to just move a millimeter towards the vision.
Yes.
And I think, solutions are celebrating the small wins
Mhm.
and really planning for the long haul, planning for the marathon. I I really burnt myself out doing the sprint model, just as
Yeah.
fast as I could, banging on every door, and that's just there's a mix between, like, sustainable energy and, like, not taking on too much and relying on your community to really feed into you and doing the good work.
What would you tell them going into it? Pick a different career field before you burn out
Yeah,
or
I was gonna say I would pray for them for
that's right.
um,
Right. Really
yeah,
question your motives.
I would yeah, um, so I would say set a long-term vision and think about all the baby steps to get there, and maybe the long-term vision is you wanna set up an incident bias reporting form in the next 6 months, and then think about all the small ways you need to get there, and then maybe extend your timeline a little bit, like, as fast as you wanna get it done, you're not planning for all the hurdles in your way. I was planning to walk into every conversation, lay the data on the table, and they would say, "Of course, why didn't we see we needed a diversity office? Now we see and we'll do it." That's you have to have another conversation and more data and more conversation. So I would say double the timeline that you think you're going to have. And then secondly, build community. So find the people who are in your corner that really build you up because when you're fighting against a system, it can one feel isolating, and two, it can kind of make you hate the institution. You can get very adversarial with your environment. So it's important to find community and life and love in the environment you're in. So it doesn't so instead of a hate relationship, it's a love-hate relationship where you like really believe in it. So you're trying to make it better instead of just feeling like you keep coming against walls. Um, and then thirdly, I would say make allies. Like one of the things I wish I would have done more of, and I did a little of, was I would be, in all these meetings talking about needing a diversity office. That was my big push at the time at Penn. Um, and really creating a relationship with the people with power outside of that. So then they develop sort of this friendship with you and then see you as advancing the good. So you're more than just a thorn in their side. And
Mhm.
then I think that kind of that's just like might be obvious to the viewers of like normal networking, but at the time you can be like really I was like, "You're wrong, I'm right." And then the person doesn't want to work with you.
By now, I'm assuming you've heard about, that would you rather run into a man in the woods or a bear in the woods, right?
Yeah.
And then there was a point in time when a Black creator said the question really was, would you rather run into a white man in a corporate meeting or a white woman? And
Oh,
without
that's good.
and without exception, they chose the white man because the white woman is more damaging to them. Now I know how those white men felt when they were reacting because the first thing I wanted to do was defend myself. And then I had to really go, okay, what was the thought and the reason behind that? So if you were going to answer that question, tell me, what would you rather walk into?
Well, I feel like one of the things I was thinking of when you said that is the white woman, I usually go in thinking she's going to be my friend. So if we're not aligned on like, oh, we're both women, that in whatever situation, like if it's a situation of like sabotage or some, that hurts more because I thought I had a friend in you. I thought I had an ally in you because we're both women.
Got
A
it.
man, a white man, I go into that meeting, guard up. I feel like we don't share a common identity. So something happens. It's discouraging, but I expected that. With a white woman, I feel like that hurts more. And then you create a narrative in your head of like, oh, I should have known better.
Uh-huh. So yeah, trust is broken.
So the trust is broken. I think we see that story between Black women and white women throughout history. We see it with the reproductive rights movement. Like
Mhm.
some of our famous feminist icons were not racially sensitive.
Right.
And we see these Black women trying to participate for their rights and white women leaning on their whiteness. It's like, yes, we're both marginalized as women, but I'm white. And so I'm entitled to be able to vote. I'm not going to get involved in the race thing because that might icky up my chance for
Right.
rights.
Mhm. Yep. Yep. There is that hierarchy.
Yeah. And that's that like intergenerational trauma that gets passed
Mhm.
down.
Well, and that's really, I mean, that's one of the things that can't be denied either is that there is generational trauma, even when you don't know, even when it wasn't your trauma, it's DNA passed down for third generation
Yeah.
that you're reacting to or we're
Yeah.
reacting to.
Yeah.
So,
Or even like in the same way you learned at 4 years old, like I can't have a Black friend. Like people are being taught, like, oh, these are the people you trust. This is who you can't trust.
uh-huh. Yeah. This is safe. This is not safe.
Yeah. When you started that question, I thought at first you were gonna say, "Would you rather have a bear or a white man in the woods?" And because I realized in my head, and this is another example of how it's really important to verbalize race, because this whole time when it said a man in the woods, I thought a white man. When you think about, oh, picture in your head a man, most people think of white man. You say picture in your head a woman,
Mhm.
who
Mhm.
do you think? But anyways, I had always been answering that question as if it was a white man in the woods. Would my answer change if it was a Black man? I'd probably still choose a bear, but
Right.
just interesting to think about. So if some of your viewers are like you and have multiracial stepchildren or children who are mixed, I actually do a multiracial, like racial identity consultancy. So people who are struggling with ideas of identity, or maybe someone said something to them, they don't know who to talk to about it, I'm a resource for them.
Beautiful. That's
It's
beautiful.
Yeah, and there's only a few of them that exist. I remember when I came up with the idea, I was surprised that there was other ones. There are other ones. But I'm like, oh, what I would have given to have someone to talk to about this 10 years ago.
Yeah. And so how do they reach you for that?
I have a website. It's called racialidentitycoach.com.
Love it.
Anyone wants any of my readings. Some of them are incredibly boring and academic, but I actually have one that I find interesting, which is about my own racial identity experience. That kind of talks about how I went from like being really insecure in my identity to being confident in who I am today.
All right. And we will watch for the book because I just think you are engaging and so passionate. It's so in there. Bump you
Thank
in, it's
you,
going to
Kim.
come out. That
Thank
all you got to do is put it on paper now and it's going to be a great resource.
Thank you, Kim. I think it will be a great resource. I'll have like about once a year somebody will hit me up from like the Netherlands or some random place in the world and say, I'm a second generation multiracial person. I've never heard this word before. I never knew there were other people like me. And they somehow they're searching so much they stumble upon my one random article. They find it because they're so desperate to be seen and to have that sort of resource. And so whenever that happens, it fills my heart because a lot of times when you're doing this work and you're not getting any praise and it's just all of the work, you can be like, what am I doing this for? And then there'll be one person that somehow found me, or a parent who will find my work and say like, this really speaks to my child. Um, and it feels good to know that I wanted someone to speak to my experience, and now these people have some.
Oh, I just love your heart. I love your presence. I'm so thankful you took the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Kim. It was so great to be here and to meet you.